Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Winning Agenda's new player Twilight Struggle series. My name's Jesse Marshall. I'm really excited to be here finishing this series. I've had so many people comment and message saying that they'd want me to go through the late war cards and get this series finished, and I do as much as anyone. I've had a really busy period recently. We've been first in lockdown, which has been a little bit difficult since I think late July, and secondly, I'm getting married very shortly. So getting married and planning a wedding whilst in lockdown, hoping that you're going to be out of lockdown in time, has been quite stressful. But good news, we are out of lockdown as of this weekend, and our wedding is going to be able to go ahead in about a week's time. So I'm pretty excited about that. Just like last time we came out of lockdown, I did one of these videos and that was nice. Now, coming out of lockdown again and here doing the final video in this series, which is great. So what are we talking about today? We're talking about the late war cards in the deck. And so we got through the early war, we got through the mid war. Obviously not every game of Twilight Struggle is going to progress to the late war. It's only, I guess, in some ways you could see it as a tiebreaker period, because you've already been through 2 scorings of the early war regions and 1 scoring of the mid-war regions. And if there is not enough of a victory point differential there to settle the game, then you move on to the late war, where all the scoring cards get shuffled back in again with the turn 7 or turn 8 reshuffle. And in the late war, you've got all these additional new cards being shuffled in as well. So one way to, I guess, at a macro level, think about these late war cards in the late war deck is to, as we're going through, think about which specific countries these late war cards can impact on, because that can drive your play when you're coming up to turn 7 and about to go into turn 8 to have these late war cards shuffled in. Then you can start to think, well, for example, the Iron Lady, which we're looking at here, the first US card, impacts on Argentina. And as a USSR play, if the USSR events this, they actually get to add 1 USSR influence in Argentina. So if Argentina is exactly controlled by the US player, so if they've got 2 and the USSR player has 0, the USSR player can event Iron Lady, which is a 3-ops card for them, and a US event. So the US event occurs that gives the US 1 VP, but it gives the USSR 1 influence in Argentina. You remove all USSR influence from UK, which is broadly irrelevant, and socialist governments is no longer playable, which is a bit annoying for the USSR, but maybe not such a big deal. But more importantly, you can then spend the 3 ops as the USSR player taking control of Argentina. So you've broken control with the 1 op from the event, and then you still get to play, because it was an enemy event, you still get to play your operations points, and you get to play those all into Argentina. So this is a 3-op card, a 3-op enemy card that the USSR player knows is going to be there in the deck in the late war, that actually allows them to take control of Argentina if Argentina is is exactly controlled by the US player. So what that means is that as we go through, it's really important to think about, because what you think about in the late war is, how can I impact the board most efficiently for final scoring? So if I'm ahead currently on victory points, and I appear to be ahead on the board, I want to make sure that my opponent is not able to efficiently flip countries and flip regions to change that equation. I'd basically want to hold on to my lead. And understanding what your opponent can do to efficiently flip countries and flip regions, or which countries you're basically probably going to lose because there's a card that just allows your opponent to take it during the late war, is something really important to know, so you don't focus your resources there and you focus your tempo and your resources and everything else you've got going for you in the other places where it's harder for them to impact, or where perhaps it hurts them a bit and you can actually cement your lead even further. Conversely, if you're the side that's below going into the behind going into the late war, either in victory points or board position or both, you want to know what might be coming up in the deck that can allow you to impact things efficiently. It's worth also noting that in this reshuffle, obviously any early war cards that are left, such as the non-start events that have just kept getting shuffled back in, are going to be there as well. Any start events that haven't been played, and any mid-war events that haven't been played. So you do have those cards that can impact kind of efficiently and effectively. Things like Brush War is probably going to have been shuffled back in. And if there's a really important good Brush War target, you can still play to drawing a Brush War. But these new cards that come into the deck also have some impact on those thoughts as well. So the Iron Lady, actually, a lot of people call it Thatcher the Betrayer, because it's not so much a US card in terms of the most powerful impact of it is actually this one influence placement for the USSR and Argentina, which is very unusual for a card in the Twilight Struggle deck for an event of one player to actually give the opposing player influence. Star Wars is the second one, and this is an extremely powerful card, also a potential DEFCON suicide card for the USSR player, so very, very important to be aware of. It's a good reward for the US player for getting ahead on the space race. It actually refers to the space race track and gives you a bonus if you are ahead. So if the US player is ahead on the space race track, play this card to search through the discard pile for a non-scoring card of your choice, and the event occurs immediately. So if the US player events this, and they're ahead on the space race, they basically just get to choose the best card in the discard pile, and it happens immediately. So it could be an ABM treaty, could be a brush war, could be a junta, or it could be any of the really powerful US events that the opponent space raced or left there. Now, it's worth noting that on turn 8, when Star Wars gets shuffled into the deck, it's quite likely that you will have had a reshuffle recently, so the discard pile will be quite small. But if you had a turn 7 reshuffle, you'll have a turn worth of cards from turn 7 in the discard pile at the start of turn 8. And if Star Wars gets dealt to you on turn 9 or 10, then you've got additional cards in there as well, and it can be really powerful. One of the things to watch out for as the USSR player with this is that if you play Star Wars and the US player is ahead on the space race track, then they get to event anything from the graveyard, from the discard pile rather, on your turn. And that means that if they event anything that allows them to coup, it's happening on your turn. So again, it degrades DEFCON on your turn as the USSR player, and you lose the game if DEFCON goes to 1. So you do need to be really careful about managing Star Wars. Obviously, you can negate the Star Wars effect if the space race is close by getting equal on the space race track, and then playing the Star Wars, which is then blank. But if you are behind or you can't catch up on the space race that turn, then Star Wars can be a bit of a hot potato to handle as the USSR player. Not just from a DEFCON suicide perspective, but in an action round when you play it, if you're getting 2 ops and they're getting the best card from the discard pile, that can be a game changer in terms of tempo. Soviets Shoot Down KAL-007 is a really important card for a couple of reasons in terms of headlining and assumptions. So the US player generally doesn't have 4-op DEFCON suicide cards, DEFCON degrader cards rather, that they can headline. So for instance, the USSR player can usually headline We Will Bury You up until the late war without worrying about losing to DEFCON suicide. Because even though the US player's headline resolves first, all of the ways that the US player can degrade DEFCON are at 3 ops, and all of the 4-op cards they can use that degrade DEFCON also improve DEFCON, for example, ABM Treaty. So in the mid-war, the USSR player can just headline We Will Bury You and know that they're not going to die to the DEFCON reduction, whereas in the late war, you've got Soviets Shoot Down KAL-007, which degrades DEFCON 1 level as a US card, and that means if the US headlines this, and it is a pretty good headline, then you can't headline We Will Bury You. And it just is another thing like Duck and Cover as well in the late war headlines that the USSR player has to be cautious of in terms of is DEFCON going to get degraded in the US headline phase, because as I said, it is a pretty good headline for the US player. So what does it do? It degrades DEFCON 1 level, which obviously is a good effect for the US because it deprives the Soviets of their Action Round 1 coup. The US gains 2 VPs, which again, 2 VPs is quite a lot for one card to grant. Like that's a significant benefit. If South Korea is US controlled, the US may place influence or attempt realignments as if they played a 4-ops card. So you get a 4-ops play. You can't coup with this as the US player, but you can place 4 ops worth of influence or attempt 4 ops worth of realignments in the headline phase if you control South Korea. So again, this is one of those things when you're thinking back to the early game or back to the mid game, should you as the USSR player and as the US player, as the US player and as the USSR player, contest South Korea a little more vigorously than perhaps India, putting aside that India is subject to Arab-Israeli war, for example, which is a recurring event, and therefore India is more vulnerable than most other Asian battlegrounds anyway. But the fact that South Korea gives you this incredibly powerful bonus in the late war, albeit on one card, is enough of a reason in the early war when you're fighting over South Korea and thinking about whether to dedicate ops to it. Something like Libya might be a better example. Like, should I put this last 2 ops to complete South Korea all these last 2 ops in Libya. You might, for Middle East scoring, you might go in the early war, well, South Korea, there's Korean War out there, so maybe I won't take the risk. Maybe I'll just go into Libya. Now, Libya is easier to coup because it can be couped at DEFCON 3 rather. So perhaps the fact that Korean War's out there versus being able to be couped more easily doesn't mean you're more likely to hold on to one than the other in the long term. But Libya doesn't give you a lot in terms of you controlling it as the US player. We do have a Libya-related card in the deck, so perhaps, again, that wasn't the best example, but it does relate to the USSR controlling it. But what I'm trying to say, I guess, is when you're thinking about where to put that 2 influence in the early war, perhaps putting it into South Korea, even though it's a bit more risky, might start to become more attractive to you if you know that on turn 8, 9, and 10, if the game gets there, you've got this really powerful trump card that is going to rely on you controlling South Korea. And you might fight a bit harder for South Korea in the early game because of that. So yeah, this is really powerful. A couple of VPs, deprive them of their coup, and you get to place 4 ops anywhere on the board that you like in the headline phase. So extremely strong because it can gain you that tempo in the headline phase. Like, you can use that to break a key USSR battleground, and then perhaps even place influence somewhere else, so that they have to respond to both of those threats on their AR1, and you've then got the tempo for the rest of that turn, which can be pretty huge. Tear down this wall, a 3-op, really, really powerful DEFCON suicide card again. So you've noted, out of these 4 cards that we've discussed so far, one of them is basically a USSR card, the Iron Lady, although it does grant a VP, which can be important to the USA. But then you've got 3 extremely powerful US events in a row. So this US late war deck is really strong, even though it's only 10 cards. So Tear Down This Wall is worth 3 ops points. It cancels and prevents Willy Brandt, so it makes it a bit harder for the USSR to come into West Germany. Not that realignments on West Germany happen all that much, but if you've got NATO in place and they had invented Willy Brandt, then they can actually realign West Germany. But once you play 10 on this wall, they can't realign West Germany again. NATO prevents that. More importantly, though, it adds 3 US influence in East Germany. So if they've only got 3 in East Germany, you take it to equal. And then you can make a free coup attempt or realignment roll in Europe using this card's ops value, which means you ignore the DEFCON restriction. So you can make a coup or attempt realignment in Europe no matter what the DEFCON rating is. And that can be really important. Now, obviously, coups in Europe, for instance, a lot of people will place the 3 influence in East Germany, then coup East Germany. A 3-op coup on East Germany, which is a 3 stability country, not super likely to succeed. But if they do only control it with 3 ops points, you put 3 in, you coup it, and you roll a 6, then you control the country, you've wiped them out. That's a pretty big change. Like, Europe is a very stable region on the board, and this card allows you to attack a otherwise very stable region with very little risk and very little investment. It's just one 3-op card you're spending, and you can completely upend the math in Europe. It also means that as the US player, it can let you take back France, which is extremely crucial, because if you control Italy, West Germany, the UK, and Spain and Portugal, and even Algeria, the USSR player can still control France, and if they over-control France, it can be extremely difficult for you to take that back. They might have picked it up with de Gaulle or Suez Crisis in the early war, and they might have just doubled down and overprotected it. If you can set up that realignment ring around it, it means they always have to be scared of Tear Down This Wall in the late war. Otherwise, they can just be, overprotected by 2 or 3 and never worry about you retaking France for the rest of the game. Tear Down This Wall says one of those key European battlegrounds, which is very likely to switch domination from one side to the other if it flips control of that one country, is now vulnerable to this one 3-op card that if the US player headlines it, not only do you get to disrupt East Germany, but you then get that free realignment on France 3 times, which if you're at a significant advantage of +3 or +4, you're very likely to wipe out the USSR player. So France no longer becomes something that the USSR can rely on holding to final scoring. And it's just another way that you can really efficiently attack something that otherwise appears largely impenetrable and which can be really key to the scoring of a region. So Tear Down This Wall, a very, very strong card. And that realignment doesn't have to be France. It can be Italy. You can set up good realigns on Italy. It can even be East Germany if you know what's coming. You might end up with West Germany, Austria, and perhaps even another country, maybe Poland with the next card that I'm talking about as well, to allow you to set up a really strong realign and even push for Europe control, which does happen from time to time. So Solidarity is, as I mentioned, a card that lets you attack Poland really efficiently as the USA. It's a 2-op card. I should have mentioned on Tear Down This Wall as well, because the US player can coup, it's a DEFCON suicide card. So if you get this and you've got Soviets shoot down KEL and you've got Star Wars in your hand, that's 3 additional DEFCON suicide cards for the USSR that they have to manage. So it can be really, really tricky for the USSR to manage all of those, get them out of their hand. A lot of them are high ops cards, but Star Wars is only a 2-op. So if the USSR player is high enough on the space race that they can't space 2-op cards anymore, but the USA player is further ahead, then Star Wars can become really dangerous because it's unspaceable and it's a DEFCON suicide card, so they might have to just hold it through and hope they don't get terrorismed or have their hand size cut. Solidarity. It's a 2-op card. It's only playable if John Paul II elected Pope is in effect. So it's an incentive again. When you're evaluating, should I event John Paul and disrupt them a bit in Poland, or should I put these 2-ops somewhere else in the mid-war? If it's coming up towards turn 7, you might want to think about, well, if I event John Paul, not only do I get to disrupt them in Poland here on AR7, for example, but I also turn on Solidarity. That is another reason, another thing that enters into that equation in your head. So this adds just straight up 3 US influence in Poland, which is pretty huge. It is a 3 stability country, so if they control it, they've got 3 more than you. But for them, for the for the USSR player, if they don't over control Poland and they've got Solidarity in hand, they have to spend ops from another card over protecting Poland before they can even play Solidarity, and then they need to put both of these ops into Poland. So it's a blank action round for them. It's worse than a blank action round on its own, but they can turn it into a blank action round if they're willing to invest 1 operations point from another card. But operations points and tempo in the late war can be really important, so them drawing this can be quite bad for them in terms of tempo and ops value. But if you draw it as a USA, it's a good headline. It puts 3 straight into Poland if Poland is really important to Europe domination. If it's balanced 3-2, 3-2, then this can threaten to flip it in your favor. Or if it's 4-1 and Poland is the only one that they control because you've already tear down this wall, East Germany, or if you're planning to tear down this wall because you've got it in your hand later in the turn, then Solidarity can, become even more of a threat because it impacts on those other realignments or on possible Europe control. And they have to spend, a pretty good card from their hand responding if they don't have Poland overprotected. And it's worth noting as well that all of these cards that affect Eastern Europe are amplified in their power by the fact that East European Unrest, which is an early war card, has a more potent late war effect. In that in the late war, you remove 2 USSR influence from 3 countries in Eastern Europe when East European Unrest is evented. And because we've got all these strong US mid-war events in the deck by the time we get to the late war, and we've got these new really powerful US late war events, the chance that they're going to be willing and able to space East European Unrest is much lower. So they often, you'll see Soviet players just have to cop that. They'll just say, okay, well, it might not necessarily affect my control of these countries right now because I had them all a bit overprotected. And these 3 ops are actually really important and I need to space something else in my hand. So I'll just play this to, take Brazil or to shore up South America. And I'll take the fact that I lose 2 in Poland and I lose 2 in East Germany. And then the US player can come in and play Solidarity on the newly weakened Poland, and the newly weakened East Germany can be attacked by Tear Down This Wall. So you can see that the cards in the deck start to create and play into that effect of the US player degrading the East European position for the Soviet player in the late war, which is a really nice subtle thing that the cards and the effects really nicely mimic the tide of the Cold War and the way things shifted and changed in different regions of the world. And I think that little package is one way that when the game does that really nicely. Reagan Bombs Libya is a pretty not ineffectual US event, but another one which you'll see, we've already got the Iron Lady, Soviets shoot down, and now Reagan Bombs Libya, which grant VPs, which is not something that a lot of US cards have done throughout the early and mid-war deck. It's actually been more Soviet cards that have been granting VPs as they're played. So now we're starting to see more US just incidental VPs coming. So it's another one where if the Soviet player has it, they're probably just going to play it. and the US gains 1 VP for every 2 USSR influence in Libya. So this is usually it'll just be 1 if the USSR controls Libya. Occasionally they will have, rolled really well on a coup, or there will have been a fight over Libya for some reason. And it's worth keeping in the back of your mind as both players that, yeah, there is a card out there in the late war deck that is going to reward the US player with victory points if the USSR over-controls Libya. So maybe you'll poke Libya if you have to poke one Middle Eastern country and place some inefficient influence earlier in the game as the US player, knowing that if the USSR's total influence number in Libya goes to 4, then Reagan bombs Libya suddenly becomes 2 victory points in the late war. And maybe that becomes relevant. So all these things, just keep them in mind as you go through the earlier turns in the game and know that these cards are in the deck later. North Sea oil stops OPEC from being playable, which can be huge. We know that OPEC is essentially another Middle Eastern scoring card for the USSR player only that can give them, significant bounty of victory points. So having North Sea oil come into effect can be powerful. It's also a 3-op card though. So if you draw it as a US player, you can play it, stop OPEC being playable, and you can play 8 cards that turn, but you have to have a very good hand for your worst card to be as good as a blank 3-op card, which is what you could otherwise play North Sea oil as. So the way I think about it as a US player is that, yes, the timing of your last play is after their last AR, so you get 2 ARs after the last AR, but still, the card that you're playing that's the worst and the worst card in your hand is probably going to have a negative effect for you. So it's unlikely that even having a free extra action round 8, so going twice in a row at the end, is going to be that impactful. If you do have an amazing hand and you've got no bad cards, then certainly event North Sea oil, take those 2 ARs later, and perhaps headline this and give up on your headline. You get this incidental benefit of no OPEC, and you get 2 action rounds in a row late, which is amazing. But if you don't, if your worst card is either going to be an empty action round effectively, because you have to repair the damage from a bad Soviet event, or not really get you very far, it's just like a 1-up a summit or something, you probably just want to play the ops from North Sea oil. As the USSR player, if you've got this in your hand, again, you can assess the US players' plays and whether you think that giving them an AR8 is going to be a big deal, especially if you've got the China card and they don't. They might not even have enough cards to be able to play an action round 8, so that might not be a problem. But also, it's 3-ops for you, so is giving them that extra action round, particularly if you play this later in the turn so they don't have advanced notice of the fact they're going to be getting action round 8, is that really such a big deal? You'll rarely see this spaced. Occasionally, if OPEC is really relevant, then you might. But again, if you've got OPEC, you can just play OPEC before this, and then OPEC's never going to get shuffled back in anyway. So North Sea oil, it's an interesting card. It kind of shakes up the turn order, and obviously preventing OPEC early in the late war can be a big deal sometimes. But I often play it for ops rather than for the event. But some people love the event, so that's interesting, I guess, in itself. Chernobyl, obviously a huge world event, and a really impactful card as well in Twilight Struggle. A 3-ops card, so for the USSR player, it's actually really easy to manage. You can play this as a 3-ops card, you play it as your last action round, and it really doesn't do anything, because it just says the US player may designate one region. For the remainder of the turn, the USSR player may not add additional influence to that region by the play of ops points via placing influence. So whatever they choose, if you play it on your last AR as the USSR player, you don't have any more action rounds anyway, so you weren't going to be placing any more influence. So it has no impact whatsoever. So this is one of those cards that if your enemy draws it, so if the USSR draws it, it's basically blank, does nothing. It's a 3-up card. They're happy to draw it. But if you draw it as the US player, it can be extremely impactful because you can headline it, designate a region, usually Europe, for the highest impact, and you can prevent them from placing ops points. So if you have Chernobyl with Tear Down This Wall or with Solidarity, all of a sudden you get to efficiently break the USSR's control of their battleground countries, not having to use, double influence placing whilst you're breaking it, because Tear Down This Wall and Solidarity both just place the number of influence points, and then they can't place any points in response, so you can just take those battleground countries. So if you're the US player and you have this combo with Chernobyl and either Tear Down This Wall or Solidarity, you can push for a Europe control victory. You must be aware, though, that they're basically going to have a turn or a number of action rounds whilst you're doing this and executing this plan to attack you elsewhere on the board. So if they can do that efficiently, and if you're actually close to losing on VPs, you probably can't actually do that because they can solidify their dominations and controls in other regions, then score them and just beat you on VPs before Europe is ever scored, even if you manage to attain Europe control. But if you either are ahead on VPs or the VP score is quite close to zero, and you're quite confident that they're not going to be able to win by scoring the other regions before Europe is scored again, then you can push for a Europe control victory with this. You can also use it to just flip a region, so it's another efficient way for you to be able to force the flip of a region. So you do, as I said, have the counterplay for the USSR player of pressing on the US player's weakest point on the board whilst Chernobyl's active, but the US player does have this level of control during the turn where they know that if they choose Africa, for example, they can flip some African battlegrounds and know that the USSR player can't flip them back that turn. So they can flip them and then overprotect them, for example, on 2 different action rounds, knowing that they're not vulnerable to counterplay there. So it can lead to some Europe control victories. It can lead to some ability to flip other regions in the late war for the US player, but there is that counterplay available to the USSR as well. An Evil Empire, less of a notable card. It just cancels flower power, prevents flower power from being played afterwards. Now, again, when it says prevents, either player can still play the card flower power. It just becomes a blank and the event doesn't happen. The US gains 1 VP. So this is just kind of vanilla 1 VP, adding to the stack of cards in this US pile that are going to just add a few VPs in the late war, very likely. So when you think about it, both players are going to play quite a few of these events. Some of them will go to space, some of them won't happen. But on average, you're probably going to get at least 1, 2, maybe 3 VPs for the US player out of this little stack here. AWOC's sale to Saudis is another interesting, way to break a country efficiently. It again affects a 3 stability country. So in and of itself, it's not just going to let you flip it. But if you're the USSR player and you draw this, and you're giving 2 US influence in Saudi Arabia, and the Middle East is quite, closely balanced, then it suddenly becomes a lot less attractive to use these 3 operations points. So again, it's not the most powerful card. You absolutely can play it as the USSR player, but it just comes at a bit of a cost to you. It weakens a battleground country that might be relevant to whether either side dominates that region, and it might just give your opponent a bit of a leg up if you use these 3 operations points somewhere else. They might have a leg up to try and challenge you in Saudi Arabia, for example. So just worth being aware of. So we'll move on to, I think we'll do neutral cards here, and then we'll see how we go for time. Might finish up the Soviet cards in the same video just to get this series done and dusted. We've only got 3 neutral cards here. So terrorism, a really important one to be aware of, because you would have seen that with all of these DEFCON suicide cards for the USSR player in the US deck, ways to reduce hand size are really important. So we've already got, a couple of hand size reducers that you can affect yourself with in terms of UN intervention, for example. And there is, in the USSR deck, another way for the USSR player to reduce hand size. But terrorism is a way to reduce your opponent's hand size proactively, which is quite scary with so many DEFCON suicide cards around. So it's a 2-op neutral event. Opponent must randomly discard 1 card. If played by USSR, an Iranian hostage crisis is in effect. The US player must randomly discard 2 cards. Events on discards do not occur. So the USSR player can get double benefit out of terrorism. They can actually make the US discard 2 cards if one of their USSR late war events is in effect, which we'll come to in a minute, Iranian hostage crisis. And it's something that, the USA player should be aware if Iranian hostage crisis has been invented, that a double terrorism is available. But both players need to be aware that if they're holding, for example, if the USSR player is holding Star Wars and hoping to just be able to hold it through the late war, a terrorism from your opponent could just end that. Even a 5-year plan from your opponent could, coming back from the early war. But terrorism is just a much less risky version of eventing 5-year plan to make your opponent discard. Because if the US player events 5-year plan in the late war, they might hit Soviets, shoot down KRW 007 and kill themselves to DEFCON. But if they event terrorism, it's risk-free. The event doesn't happen. The player discards the card and it opens them up to potential DEFCON suicide. War Games is a very controversial card. A lot of players say they wish War Games wasn't in the game because it's the only alternate victory condition in the game. But what it does is it adds a little bit of spice back in. It's a comeback mechanic. It's a way that if you're really far behind on the board and on VPs, you can still win a game of Twilight Struggle. DEF CON obviously allows you to do that as well. But yeah, War Games is, other than DEF CON and 20 VPs, War Games is the only other way that you can win. So for operations points are pretty powerful, neutral. So really happy to draw this as either player because you can just play it for those 4 ops points and that's great news. But it's also got this really powerful event too. So if DEF CON is at status 2, you may immediately end the game without final scoring after giving the opponent 6 VPs. So if you go into the late war and you, at any point, your opponent has 7 or more victory point lead, you're in danger of losing if DEF CON is at 2 in one action round immediately. And that's really scary. So you kind of often get into this dance where you're like, do they have it, don't they have it? DEF CON's at 2, it's my action round, my opponent's at 7 VPs. I could make this play, but I could also make this other play which gains me a VP but is less efficient. Maybe I should just gain the VP so they can't War Games me. But then maybe I lose long-term advantage in this region because they can then take this important battleground country back. So you do get a few of those little mini games around War Games, which can be quite interesting. Do they have it? Don't they have it? Should I try and get out of War Games range? But yeah, it's just an interesting card to think about and just definitely be aware of, because just losing a game to War Games when you think that you're coasting to victory is a pretty bad feeling. So definitely keep it in mind in the late war. Iran-Iraq War, as described in the title, just like all the other war cards, the player who plays it, it's a 2-op card firstly, like the other wars, the player who plays it rolls a die, subtracts 1 for every opponent adjacent country, and it affects Iran and Iraq. That's pretty much all there is to it. 2 mill-ops, and it's not one that you will often see evented, although there are a lot of times in the late war where just getting 2 extra VPs, like one player's on 18, or the aforementioned War Games, and you're just searching for cards in your hand that can give you VPs to get you out of War Games range. Sometimes you will see Iran-Iraq War evented, but it is a bit harder to succeed because you'll usually have at least one opponent adjacent card, but country rather. But even if you don't, rolling a 4+ for 2 VPs and a control of a Middle East country tends not to be the most important thing on the board in a lot of situations, and you often want to just be affecting another key region. It's rarely going to be the Middle East that's the most key region on the board at this point in the game. But yeah, definitely any war is powerful. The ability to flip a country with 1 2-ops card, and Iran-Iraq War granting VPs also very relevant in a lot of late war situations. So we'll come to the Soviet deck. This will be a little bit of a longer video, but that's okay. And I think there is a bit less to say about the Soviet deck than about the US deck anyway. So Iranian hostage crisis, very much be aware of this, because if you're the USA player and it's the mid-war and they've couped you in Iran, for example, on turn 7, just don't bother fighting for it. Like, unless you absolutely have to, because there's going to be this card in the late war that is just going to remove all your influence in Iran and add 2 USSR influence. So basically, as soon as this card is dealt to the USSR player, they have the option of just controlling Iran. So be aware of that. It also doubles the effect of terrorism against the US, as we discussed, meaning that if it is evented and then terrorism is subsequently evented by the USSR player, the USA player must discard 2 cards, which is a very big penalty. So be aware of that. Be aware, once it's in play as well, of thinking about the China card. If you don't have the China card as the US player and Iranian hostage crisis is in effect, then you're in danger of losing your action round 7 if they terrorism you. Not only can you be in DEF CON suicide danger, but you can lose your action round 7 because you simply don't have enough cards in hand anymore to be able to have an action round 7. Also really think about that in terms of using UN intervention in the late war and other things that reduce your own hand size. Marine barracks bombing. Remove all US influence in Lebanon, plus remove 2 additional US influence from anywhere in the Middle East. So you can see a theme here. In the US deck, we had events that were improving position in Europe consistently, particularly in Eastern Europe. And in the USSR deck, we're seeing events that are degrading the US position in the Middle East and improving the USSR position. So Lebanon, one of the safest countries for the US to hold in the early war and the mid-war because it's not affected by Muslim revolution, is now in danger of having US influence removed. So all influence in Lebanon, meaning that if you've got a really good coup on Lebanon in the early war as the US and you've got 6 influence in there and you're feeling like it's really stable, the USSR can simply kick you out in the late war by removing it all with marine barracks bombing, plus 2 additional influence from anywhere else in the Middle East. So that can be 1 from 2 separate battleground countries or 2 from the same battleground country, which again can have a significant impact as a headline. So marine barracks bombing, a really good headline. Sometimes it'll do very little if the US has a bad position and doesn't in the Middle East and doesn't control Lebanon, or the US has a couple of really strongly controlled countries and doesn't control Lebanon. But sometimes if the US controls Lebanon and everything else is pretty finely balanced in the Middle East, marine barracks bombing can have a really big impact. Ortega elected in Nicaragua is a very interesting DEFCON suicide card. So it's a reason that you will see some USA players avoid Cuba. I don't think you should avoid Cuba because of Ortega. So what it says is it's a 2-ops card that says remove all US influence from Nicaragua. Firstly, one of the first Twilight Struggle games I ever played against Jess, one of the other Winning Agenda members, Jess introduced me to the game. We had this situation where Central America scoring was really important, and we were just cooing and counter-cooing Nicaragua. For some reason, that was the country that determined domination, and one of us was going to win if there was a dominated Central America scoring scored, and it seemed more efficient to keep cooing Nicaragua rather than placing one influence in one of the other non-battleground countries and just getting cooed. So we ended up cooing Nicaragua heaps and placing lots of influence, and it ended up with one player with a lot of influence in there. It was like quite close in terms of 10 to 15 influence or something, 10 to 12. And I was playing as the US, and then Jess just played Ortega elected in Nicaragua and removed all my influence from Nicaragua, and I was so mad because I didn't know this card was coming. So, as I said, be aware of things like that, if you're piling influence as a US player into Lebanon or into Iran or into Nicaragua, you've got these cards that basically just are revolutions that let you just let the USSR player just get rid of all your influence from those countries. So don't do that. Don't pile your influence into Nicaragua. Then the most important part is the USSR player can make 1 free coup attempt with this card's operations value in a country adjacent to Nicaragua. So the countries adjacent to Nicaragua, I think, are Costa Rica and Cuba, most importantly. And Cuba is I think Guatemala as well. But Cuba is a battleground country, obviously. So if the US player events this card, then the USSR player can make a coup on Cuba, being a battleground country, on the US player's turn. And that's obviously what we call a DEFCON suicide card. Because if that occurs and DEFCON degrades to 1, then it's actually the US player that loses because it happens on their turn. So ways that you can get around that. 1, DEFCON might not be at 2 when you play this, might be higher, the way you can get around any DEFCON suicide card. The other is don't play into Cuba, because they can't coup any other battlegrounds other than Cuba. So unless the USA player has influence in Cuba, then this is not a DEFCON suicide card. And you won't see US influence in Cuba in every game, right? It's not the most common place for the US to have influence, but because of Fidel, but because it's adjacent to the US, if they do realign Fidel out of there, then they do have the option to simply just play into Cuba, regardless of the rest of their board position, because it's adjacent to the superpower. And Ortega elected in Nicaragua is just one thing in the deck that might give the USA player pause about whether they do that. It makes them at least think about, do I want to take Cuba or not? And if that question of do I want to place 3 into Cuba to control it is equally weighted with some other battleground country on the board, on turn 7, for example, the US player might just say, I'll take the other option because I don't want to expose myself to Ortega and to DEFCON suicide that way. And that's a perfectly reasonable decision. So again, just be aware that this is coming in the deck and let that impact on your earlier decision making in the game. Latin American debt crisis. Unless the US player immediately discards a 3 or greater operations card, double the USSR, it should be double the USSR influence in 2 countries in South America. Important to remember, this doesn't affect Central America. So despite being, Latin American debt crisis, it's only South America. the US player immediately discards a 3 or greater operations card. So it's similar to blockade, but the effect is very different to blockade and very different in value. So double the USSR influence in two countries. Blockade removes US influence, extremely strong, in a key battleground country where they're likely to have influence in the early war. Latin American debt crisis doubles USSR influence. So you'll often find the play pattern in South American battlegrounds particularly will be that it will be coup and counter coup. So you're quite unlikely to end up in these situations where there's manual influence placement, except with Junta. That's one example where the other player's influence may subsist in a country that you control, but otherwise it's a lot of sort of 4-op coups changing control of countries. You will sometimes see a bit of an ops war over Chile because it's less efficient to coup, but a lot of the time when Chile is fought for, it'll be with the USA player controlling Argentina and Peru and then realigning the USSR out of Chile. So again, you're less likely to have large numbers of enemy influence if you're the USA player sitting in your battleground countries. But if you do, for some reason, if for example Venezuela is like 4 and 6, 4 for the USSR player and 6 for the USA player who controls it, then all of a sudden Latin American debt crisis becomes quite a problem. Because if you event it and you don't discard a 3 or greater operations card, the USSR influence in Venezuela will get doubled from 4 to 8, and your influence will stay at 6, and all of a sudden they control the country. So there are definitely situations where this can be really powerful, and there are situations where as the USSR player, if you have it in hand, you can start poking South America, putting a few influence in here and there, knowing that that they're unlikely to have a 3-ops card later in the turn because of the way that they're playing, and then you can hit them with Latin American debt crisis and all of a sudden take control of a couple of South American battlegrounds. So this is another one of those cards. Just be aware of it. If you see that play pattern, if you see your opponent just jamming into South America, maybe hold on to a 3-ops card. If you see your opponent jamming into South America, maybe try and fight them elsewhere if you don't have a 3-ops card to make it harder for them, or at least more of a risk and more of an opportunity cost for them to actually spend the action round eventing Latin American debt crisis. But as the USSR player, know that this is one of the things in the deck that can help you swing a region a little bit. There aren't many things in this USSR late war deck that can help you efficiently swing regions. We've got a couple of things that target specific countries and marine barracks bombing that can help in the Middle East. And we've got a couple more coming up next that affect Europe specifically. But Latin American debt crisis can help you affect South America in a positive way. So Pershing 2 deployed is a USSR card that positively affects the USSR in Europe, which can be really, really important, as well as granting a VP, which, as I said, is rarer in this USSR late war deck than it is for the USA in some ways, although there are some conditional VPs as well, which we'll come to later. So USSR gains 1 VP, remove 1 US influence from up to 3 countries in Western Europe. So as a headline, or even as an action round play, this can be really, really strong. It can be very strong on turn 10, right? Because on turn 10, if things are finely balanced, you're looking often for plays that will force your opponent to respond or significantly disrupt their victory points. And particularly on action round 6 in turn 10 as the USSR, or sorry, action round 7, because the USA player gets to go last, that's a huge bonus for them. So they can play like Voice of America on AR7 on turn 10 and just like wipe you out from 1, 2, maybe even 3 regions of domination and just significantly harm your VPs, which is why you'll often see USSR players wanting to over-control battleground countries in the late war, particularly on turn 10 when you're heading towards final scoring, to reduce the impact of things like Voice of America on AR7 on turn 10. So having something like Pershing 2 in your hand as a USSR player on turn 10 means that on your last action round, you can potentially, if they haven't overprotected their countries in Western Europe, remove 1 or maybe even 2 countries' control for them, which might impact on scoring and force them to respond. So then if they are holding Voice of America, which they want to event, they've all of a sudden got to think, do I want to instead maybe place one of these influence into Europe and forego that event because it's going to get me back 5 VPs, which is quite a lot. And again, that then cascades back into the earlier action rounds where the USA player might start thinking, well, I also need to overprotect my battlegrounds in Europe because if the USSR player has Pershing, then they can start degrading my position there and potentially try and deprive me of some victory points. So, it's all about knowing these cards are in the deck, how they impact on your play, preparing for them, and making sure that you are doing the best you can to mitigate the effect if they do occur at the wrong time on your tempo and on your overall board position. But Pershing definitely has a key role, and it's a key threat out there for the USSR player. The Reformer, extremely powerful. So these two Gorbachev-related cards, the Reformer and Glasnost, might, if you follow the history of the Cold War, you might think, Gorbachev was a really big figure and a really impactful personality, and you'd want the cards to be really powerful, to reflect the impact that he had on the trajectory of the Cold War. And you might look at these and think, they don't just win the game for the USSR player. Not that that's what Gorbachev did in the end for the USSR, but you might think that they're not as powerful as they could be. But really, when you have a think about it, the Reformer, add 4 USSR influence in Europe, no more than 2 per country. If the USSR is ahead of the US in VP, which will often be the case coming into the late war, then 6 influence may be added instead. Now, adding 6 influence is second only to Marshall Plan in terms of influence on the board. And it's in many ways more powerful because you can add 2 per country, whereas Marshall Plan can only add 1 per country. So the Reformer is, as a headline, if you're ahead on VPs, an extremely powerful card. It's very, very, very strong, and can allow you as the USSR player to get some significant tempo on a key turn in the late war. Now, obviously, Europe may not be the main battleground. There may be, depending on the scoreboard and how far ahead or behind you are, depending on the board position and whether the US player has amassed this amazing board position that you need to degrade elsewhere. Sometimes you draw the Reform and you'll be like, whatever. Like, it doesn't do enough for me. It's not going to help me win the game. No card in Twilight Struggle is going to really do that for you all the time. But just in terms of the power ceiling for this and how much impact it can have and how likely it is to be able to grab at least some tempo for you, particularly if you're ahead on VPs, it's just massive. Like all of those 6 influence that you're adding can be relevant. It can be 2 in West Germany, 2 in France, 2 in Italy. Maybe none of them are overprotected, and maybe that's just really impactful. And there are very few other cards in the game that can have that level of impact on regularly and consistently on a really key region of the game. So the Reform is really strong. It also says the USSR may no longer conduct coup attempts in Europe. Now, coup attempts in Europe are very rare, unlikely to be a problem. It also then improves the effect of the Glasnost event. And Glasnost, which we'll come to next, being improved, is a really, really significant benefit. So as the USSR player, I think anytime you draw the Reformer on turn 8, you're pretty happy. You've got a great headline or just a great play on an action round, and you're improving the effect of Glasnost. So Glasnost says it's a 4 ops card, firstly. USSR gains 2 VPs, improve DEFCON 1 level, and then if the Reformer is in effect, you may place influence or attempt realignments as if you played a 4 ops card. Now, Glasnost, unfortunately, if you haven't played the Reformer, is basically a US card, which is a nice little twist in terms of historical analogies as well, in terms of Gorbachev's influence on the Cold War. But basically what it reads as the US player, if the Reformer is not in effect, is you give them 2 VPs and then you get an ABM treaty. So you can give them 2 VPs, improve DEFCON, and then, make a coup at DEFCON improved by 1 level, which can be on a battleground country with a 4 ops card, which is extremely strong. So Glasnost, if the Reformer hasn't been played yet and you're the US player and you draw this, you're usually pretty happy. The USSR player, it can, as a headline, be really strong. So you can headline this and it can counteract their Soviets shoot down KL007 DEFCON degrade, for example. You can headline this and then coup in Asia if that's really important and you need a way to get a coup in Asia. It also just gains you 2 VPs along the way. And maybe if the Reformer is in effect, you get to go headline this, gain 2 VPs, improve DEFCON for my first action round so I can coup Asia, and I'll also place 4 influence points somewhere else. So they have to respond to that, meaning that they're less likely to be able to coup on their action round 1. So maybe I then get a subsequent coup again in Africa or something after that. So Glasnost can be extremely powerful for the Soviet player if you do have the Reformer, or even if you don't and you need that coup in Asia, for example. But it also has that risk of being really, really strong for the US player if the Reformer is not in effect and being sort of like a mini ABM treaty. So Iran-Contra scandal, not a very powerful event, but one that can be relevant and has a couple of things worth noting about it. So it's a 2-ops card, is what it is. All US realignment rolls have a -1 die roll modifier for the remainder of the turn. If realignments are really important, and often you'll be setting up realignments in the late war, and then if you draw this, you can consider headlining this because it affects both offensive and defensive realignment rolls. So because both players roll when there's a realignment attempt, this actually, if you are the Soviet player and you're trying to realign Brazil, for example, on your next AR, whilst this event is in effect, this will affect the US player's defensive realignment roll, if you like, for Brazil. So when you as the Soviet player try to realign Brazil, both players roll a die. The US player's die will be modified by -1. So it basically makes their realignments less likely to succeed and your realignments more likely to succeed as the Soviet player. So it can be quite powerful. Realignments can be quite good and quite important in the late war as a way, particularly if you're a little bit behind and just 1 or 2 key countries being flipped will make all the difference. Maybe Iran-Contra scandal will be the way to go. But a lot of the time it'll be relatively blank because you won't be intending to realign anyway. So Older James Remix, one that I've lost to quite a lot. On turn 8, if you've, as the US player, had to hold over Lone Gunman and your opponent just headlines Older James Remix, you can sometimes just tear your hair out. If you don't have the China card, you just straight up lose. Unless you have a way to improve DEFCON, because they've attacked your hand size, so you get to hold no cards through to the next turn, unless you have the China card, as I said. And they get to look at your hand, they can see that you've got a DEFCON suicide card, and they get to choose something else. So there's no way you're going to survive that. It's basically one of the very few sure kills in the game in terms of DEFCON suicide, is that sort of thing. But the other amazingly powerful thing about this as a headline in the late war for the USSR is you can just take a good scoring card out of their hand. And as like a 3-ops card and a headline, you're degrading their hand size. Like you're making it harder for them to set up a hold for next turn, and you're forcing them to play the worst card in their hand just by removing a different one from their hand, which is very strong as an effect in and of itself. But the fact that you get to choose which one is just so strong. Like I've had, games where as the US player, I've held on to Asia and I think this game's on YouTube as well. Got 8 VPs in Asia just waiting to be scored. I finally draw Asia scoring on turn 8. I'm like, yep, here we go. The opponent headlines Older James, takes that Asia scoring, and that's my best region on the board, and I lose the game because of that. So very, very strong card. As the USSR player, you're always happy to see it. As the USA player, again, in a very terrible effort by me, game against Sankt, actually, Chris Way, one of the best players in the world, I had a brain fade and forgot that as the USA player, if you draw this, you can just hold it to your last AR, and unlike 5-year plan, the card you discard, the event doesn't occur. So I had this and a couple of DEFCON suicide cards, and I was like, I'm dead to DEFCON. But of course, I could have just played this on my last AR, which I did realize halfway through the turn, but I'd already made some suboptimal plays before that. You can play this on your last AR and discard that DEFCON suicide card you had left in hand, or rather force your opponent to choose to make you discard the DEFCON suicide card. The DEFCON suicide card must be your only card in hand at that point. It's worth noting because your opponent does get to choose. But you're the US player, you have 2 cards in hand, you have Older James and Ortega elected in Nicaragua, for example, and you control Cuba. So if you played Ortega, they would coup Cuba and you would die. Instead, you play Older James, they have to choose to make you discard the Ortega, and the event doesn't occur, so you're all safe. So Older James, as the US player, is not a bad one to draw because you can just make them force you to discard your worst card at the end of your turn. You can also do that with a bad scoring card, which is very similar to 5-year plan and is very important. So a very powerful card on both sides, can be used to great effect by the US player. I guess a bit of a double agent twist if we want to go to the flavor side of things, but certainly as the USSR player, if you get this off in the headline phase and they've got something really important in hand, or you can kill them to Defcon Suicide, it can be the most powerful card in the game. Yuri and Samantha is the last card in the deck, and it's got. I encourage you to read the flavor and the history around this card. It's very, very interesting little episode in the Cold War, kind of like a funny little moment of humanity. But Yuri and Samantha says USSR receives 1 VP for each US coup attempt made for the remainder of the current turn. So as a headline again, as a US player, you may want to be making several coups. You might be in this situation where you need to be coupping non-battlegrounds in Africa and Central America to flip them, and the USSR player suddenly headlines Yuri and Samantha, and you're like, oh, I have to give you a VP every time I want a coup. That's a huge blowout. But other times, you're just like, I wasn't planning on coupping anyway. I was planning on doing all these other things and playing these powerful US late war events, and I was never going to coup, so I don't care. And as the USSR player, you're often going to have better headlines than this. But sometimes you will know that it's going to be a coup-filled turn, lots of back and forth coups, maybe DEFCON's high, maybe something else weird is happening, and you'll go, yeah, I'm going to headline Yuri and Samantha because I think that's going to have a huge impact here. It certainly has a high ceiling in terms of the impact it can have. 2, 3, even 4 VPs could be massive. Like, that's a huge return to get from any card. But a lot of the time it will just have absolutely no impact. And as the US player, you can just play this... as a US player, you can just play this on your last AR for no negative effect whatsoever. So it's another one like Iran-Contra scandal, where if it's played by... And Older James, where if it's played by the USSR player at the start of the turn, it can have a significant impact, but it's also not a danger at all for the USA player for them to have in their hand. And that, I think, brings us to the end of the entire deck for Twilight Struggle. I really hope that you've enjoyed this series. Please let me know in the comments what you thought of this video, and if you think there's anything important about any of these late war cards that I didn't mention. I hope you're all enjoying the game a lot. I love Twilight Struggle, and I can't wait to get back to it. I'm taking a little bit of a break from the Itzel. I decided not to play in the Itzel this season, just because of getting married and time commitments and everything else. I couldn't commit to being able to do it, so I'm really sad about that. But good luck to all of the players who are playing in the Itzel this year. It's a fantastic tournament. It's a great way to meet and get to know people from all over the world, and I've enjoyed some of the incredible games I've got to play against players from completely different areas of the world who I never would have met or come across if not for the Itzel. So thanks to Luis and Tassos and the organisers of the Itzel. I look forward to jumping back in hopefully next year. And in terms of the Reddit Twilight Struggle League, I do still have a few games to go. I'm hoping to try and schedule a few of those in a few weeks' time and finish off this season. We've got currently 2 wins and 3 losses or thereabouts, so hoping to at least even the ledger and stay in the style in the top division. But yeah, there will definitely be more Twilight Struggle content coming from the channel. It has been a bit slower lately because of life reasons, but hope you enjoyed this video. And yeah, if you enjoy Twilight Struggle, check out some of my other Twilight Struggle videos. If you want to see some other games, check out some of my Flesh and Blood or other videos as well. And yeah, have a good day. Catch you around.